I want to tell you about the most beautiful autumn day of my life. The leaves were red and gold. The mountain air was cool and clean. My husband was smiling. My friend was laughing. And then they pushed me off a cliff. I survived. My little girl survived. And the people who saved us, you will never guess who they were. Stay with me. This is a story about what real love looks like and where it comes from when you least expect it. My name is Susan Hartley. I live in the Blue Ridge foothills of Western Virginia, now in a little house with yellow shutters and a garden that my father-in-law, I'll explain that word in time, tends every single morning like it's a sacred duty. But before any of that, I need to take you back to a Saturday in October. A Saturday that started out looking like the most perfect autumn day you've ever seen. The trees along the ridge behind our house were on fire that morning. I don't mean that literally, of course, but when you live in the Appalachian foothills in October, you know exactly what I'm describing. Red maple and orange oak and yellow hickory, all blazing together in a way that takes your breath away. The sky was the deep, impossible blue that only comes in October. There was a cool bite in the air that smelled like wood smoke and fallen leaves. And somewhere down the road, a neighbor's rooster was crowing even though it was well past 8 o'clock. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror that morning for a long time, longer than I had in years. My daughter, Emma, she was 8 years old, had already been dressed, fed her medication, and settled into the living room with her picture books. Emma has cerebral palsy. She's been my whole world since she was diagnosed at age 3. She can walk, but slowly and unsteadily, like she's always crossing a deck in a gentle swell. She can say a few words, Mama, hurt, stop, more. But most of what she communicates with her eyes, and those eyes see everything. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I stood in front of that mirror and I thought, when did I stop looking at myself? I genuinely could not remember the last time. I had stood still long enough to see my own face. Every morning for 8 years had been the same rhythm: Emma's medicines, Emma's breakfast, Emma's physical therapy appointment, Emma's bath, Emma's bedtime. And then I'd fall into bed and do it all again. I wasn't complaining. I want you to understand that. Emma was my daughter, and I loved her with every breath in my body. But that morning, staring at my own face in that fogged-up mirror, I realized I had almost entirely ceased to exist as a person separate from her care. It was my husband, Mark, who had suggested the hike. Mark Hartley. We'd been married just over 10 years. He was a civil engineer, quiet by nature, the kind of man who fixes things around the house without being asked and always knows what the weather will be before you check the app. I had trusted him the way you trust the ground beneath your feet. You don't think about it. It's just there. Come on, Suze, he said at breakfast that morning, sliding a mug of coffee in front of me. Let's get out of the house. Fresh air. You've barely been outside in weeks. He had that easy smile on the one I'd fallen in love with. Diane's coming too. She's been asking about you. Diane Prescott. She was younger than me by 4 years, about 34 at the time, and she had come into our lives through the hiking group. Mark had joined the year before. She was bright and energetic, the kind of woman who laughs easily and remembers everyone's birthday. She had taken to calling me Big Sister, almost from the first time we met, linking her arm through mine on our walks, and chattering about everything from her job to her weekend plans. I had no close friends at that time. When you're the full-time caregiver for a disabled child, friendships tend to fall away like leaves, and Diane had become something like a younger sister to me. I genuinely liked her. I had no reason to suspect a thing. We dropped Emma at my sister Patricia's house that morning. Emma gripped my sleeve at the door, her small fingers tight with an anxiety she couldn't put into words. "I'll be back soon, sweetheart," I told her, squeezing her hand. "Be good for Aunt Patricia." She looked at me with those clear, knowing eyes, and I remember thinking, even then, that something in her expression looked like fear. But I kissed her forehead and smiled and went. I didn't know, how could I know, that I was walking toward the worst thing that would ever happen to me. The drive up to the trailhead took about 40 minutes. Diane sat in the back, talking about some movie she'd seen, and Mark drove, one hand on the wheel, relaxed and easy. The three of us laughed about something. I can't even remember what, and I leaned my head against the window and watched the mountains roll past and thought I needed this. I really needed this. The trail was steep right from the start, but I didn't mind. My legs were happy to work. 8 years of my life had been spent in hospital waiting rooms and therapy, clinic hallways, and the narrow corridor between our kitchen and Emma's bedroom. And now here I was, in the open air, with the leaves spinning down around me. Like something out of a painting. Diane looped her arm through mine on the switchbacks and complained about her knees, and I laughed and told her she was 20 years too young to be talking like that, and she squeezed my arm and said, "I love you, big sister," and I believed every word. We reached the summit a little after 2 in the afternoon. Mark pulled 2 cans of beer and a paper bag of trail mix from his pack. "Let's sit a while," he said. "No hurry to get back." The view was extraordinary, ridge after ridge, receding into blue haze. A hawk turning lazy circles in the updraft far below us. I sat on a flat rock and cracked open my beer, and thought this is what life is supposed to feel like. Mark poured slowly. He kept refilling. He was in no hurry. I didn't understand then why he kept urging me to drink, kept saying, "Relax, relax. What's the rush?" But I understand now. He was waiting, waiting for the other hikers to clear the summit, waiting for the shadows to lengthen, waiting for the mountain to belong only to us. By 4 o'clock, the summit was empty except for the 3 of us. The warm afternoon light had turned amber, and the air had that particular stillness that comes just before things change. "We should head down," Mark said, standing up. There was something different in his voice, something that wasn't quite right. I didn't catch it then, or maybe I didn't want to. We started down the trail on the far side of the ridge, away from the parking lot. The path was narrow. On the left, the mountain fell away steeply, not a sheer cliff, but a long, punishing drop through brush and rock and scrub oak, down into a ravine so deep the shadows at the bottom were already black as midnight. Diane was behind me. Mark was in front. And then 2 things happened at the same time. Mark stopped and turned, and Diane's hands landed on my back. Not the hands of someone steadying you on a narrow path. The hands of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. I looked at Mark's face in the instant before it happened. 10 years of marriage. The face I had made breakfast beside every morning. The face I had watched cry when Emma was born. And those eyes were not looking at me. They were looking past me, at the drop. And then I was falling. If you're finding the story compelling, please hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Your support helps us share more important stories like this one. Now, let's continue with what happened next. You might think that falling off a mountain is something that happens fast. And in one sense, you're right. There is a moment, a single terrible moment, where the world tilts and your feet lose the earth, and everything you thought was solid turns out to be nothing at all. That moment is very fast. But the rest of it, the tumbling, the crashing, the silence that follows that part takes a long time. Long enough to understand everything. Long enough to know, mid-fall, exactly what had happened. I don't remember landing. I remember the sound of leaves, and then a roaring, and then nothing at all. When I next knew anything, it was darkness and cold, and a pain so comprehensive. It had ceased, in a strange way, to be pain, and had become simply the entire weather of my body. I remember the smell of damp earth and decay, and something sweeter underneath autumn leaves, crushed ferns. I remember trying to call out and finding that the sound stopped somewhere inside my chest, like a door being quietly shut. I don't know how long I lay there. Hours, certainly. The sky above me, visible in a narrow strip between the rocks and brush, went from dark blue to black. Stars appeared. An owl called somewhere above me, asking its one repeated question. I was found at dawn by a man named George Patterson. George was 73 years old that autumn. He and his wife, Eleanor, lived in an old hunting cabin about halfway up the mountain, a place they'd moved to the previous spring. For reasons I wouldn't fully understand until later, George had come down at first light to the creek at the base of the ravine to haul water, as he did every morning, and he found me wedged in a crevice between two boulders, unconscious, bleeding, my left arm broken, and 3 ribs cracked. He told me afterward that he'd thought, at first, that I was dead. He put his hand to my neck and felt a pulse, and then he did something that, even now, fills me with a kind of reverence I cannot fully express. That 73-year-old man put me on his back and carried me up the mountain. I don't know how long it took him. He never told me. He said only, I just kept walking. His knees, I later learned, had been bad for years. His back had given him trouble since his 50s. He carried 130 pounds of broken woman up a mountain trail in the pre-dawn cold, and he did not stop. Eleanor Patterson met them at the cabin door. She was 69, small and spare, with a face so deeply lined, it looked like a topographic map of the very mountain they lived on, but her eyes were bright and quick and absolutely certain. In the week that followed, she became my nurse. She made splints from kindling and wrapped my ribs with strips torn from old flannel shirts. She boiled water with herbs she gathered herself from the woods above the cabin yarrow. Plantain, something she called healing root that I still don't know the proper name for. She changed the poultice on my forehead twice a day. There was no cell service on the mountain. There was no nearby hospital. There was only Eleanor's lifetime of practical knowledge and George's steadiness and the small wood-burning stove that kept the cabin warm. I woke up on the 7th day. The first thing I knew was the smell wood smoke and something herbal and the faint sweetness of pine resin. The ceiling above me was raw lumber, dark with age. A single small window showed a strip of gray morning sky. A fire snapped in the stove nearby. I tried to lift my left arm, and the pain spoke to me very clearly, no. Well, said a voice beside me, dry as autumn leaves. You decided to stay. I turned my head carefully and saw Eleanor Patterson sitting in a wooden chair beside the cot, her hands folded in her lap, watching me with an expression that combined profound relief with the practical satisfaction of someone whose work has paid off. She rose and put her rough, warm hand against my forehead. Fever's gone, she said. George, she called toward the other room. George, she's awake. George appeared in the doorway, stooping slightly because the frame was low. He had the look of a man who had spent 60 years outdoors, weathered brown, lean, with big-knuckled hands and a white mustache that twitched when he was thinking. He looked at me the way you look at something you weren't sure would survive. There she is, he said. I tried to speak, and what came out was a sound I'm not sure I can describe. Not quite a word, not quite a cry. It was the sound of a person who has been through something terrible and has arrived somehow on the other side. Eleanor took my hand. "You go ahead and cry," she said matter-of-factly. "That's what crying is for." And I did. I cried until I had nothing left. When I could finally speak, I told them what I could remember. Mark stopping on the path. Diane's hands. The moment I understood, it came out in pieces, with long silences between them. Eleanor held my hand throughout. George stood very still, and I watched his big hands close slowly into fists at his sides, and I watched his face go through something private and terrible. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That ain't the act of a human being." It was the exact right thing to say. That evening, after Eleanor had brought me a bowl of beef, broth and crackers from a tin, and the cabin had settled into its nighttime quiet, George spoke again. He sat in the chair by the stove, and he said, "We got our own story, Eleanor and me, if you want to hear it." I did want to hear it. George and Eleanor Patterson had farmed in the Shenandoah Valley for 40 years. 3 kids, 2 boys, and a daughter. They'd built that farm from nothing, worked it through drought and flood, and the years when the commodity prices dropped so low that the only reason to keep going was stubbornness and the smell of good dirt after rain. When they got to their late 60s, they decided to give the farm to the children. All of it, the house, the acreage, the equipment. They kept nothing back. "Figured that's what parents do," George said. "You give everything you have to your children." Within 2 years, both boys had stopped returning calls. The daughter had explained, gently and firmly, that she didn't have room for them. The reasons shifted over time: too busy, house too small, couldn't manage the extra expense. But the bottom line never changed. George and Eleanor Patterson, who had given everything they had to their children, had nowhere to go. They'd found the old hunting cabin through a friend of a friend. No utilities, no neighbors, wood heat and hauled water, and the mountain for company. "We were thrown away," Eleanor said quietly. She didn't say it bitterly, just plainly, the way you state a fact about the weather. The 3 of us sat in the light of the dying fire, and the thing that connected us, the particular, precise shape of being discarded by the people who should have loved you, was so clear and so heavy in that small room that no one needed to name it. Eleanor reached over and put her hand over mine, and I put my other hand over hers. The fire ticked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the November trees. I slept better that night than I had in months. But in the morning, I lay in the gray light before dawn and thought of Emma, my daughter, 8 years old, at home with a man who had just tried to kill me, and a woman who had put her hands on my back and pushed. And I knew, with a clarity that cut through the fog of injury and grief like a cold blade, that I could not simply go to the police. Not yet. Not without what I needed first. I want to stop here for a moment and explain something about how a person thinks when they have been pushed off a mountain and have spent a week recovering in a stranger's cabin with cracked ribs and a broken arm and the full knowledge that their husband tried to murder them. Because people sometimes ask me, "Why didn't you just go straight to the police?" And the honest answer is I thought about it. I lay on that narrow cot and I turned it over and over in my mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking for the flaw. Here is what I knew. I had no witnesses. The summit had been empty. Diane and Mark had had time days to agree on their story. They would say I lost my footing. They would say they tried to catch me. They would say they were devastated. Mark, especially, knew how to be credible. He was a quiet man with a solid reputation, an engineer with 20 years at the same firm, a neighbor people liked and trusted. Diane was bright and likable, and had absolutely no history of trouble. And me? I was a dead woman who had somehow survived. Officially, I was missing, presumed dead, which meant that if I walked into the police station looking like I did thin, scarred, my arm in a homemade splint, and told my story, what would happen? Mark would weep. He would talk about the terrible accident, his missing wife, his desperate worry, and I would be the unhinged survivor making wild accusations. I needed proof. Two things specifically. First, I needed evidence of the affair. If Mark had a reason to want me gone, and nothing says motive, quite as clearly as a girlfriend waiting in the wings, then the rest of the story would hold together. Second, I needed something in their own voices, their own words, an admission, or something close enough to one, that couldn't be explained away. A recording. The idea came to me while I was staring at the old battery-powered radio on the shelf across from my cot. It was a small device, barely bigger than a paperback book. And I thought small. Recording. Hide it. Wait. I told George and Eleanor that I needed a few more days to heal, and then I needed to go back down to town. George nodded without asking questions, which I appreciated more than I can say. Eleanor brought me more broth. When I was able to walk the perimeter of the cabin without stopping to rest, I knew it was time. Coming off the mountain felt like stepping into a different world. The town below our town, Winchester Falls, a small city of about 60,000 in the western Virginia Valley, was going about its business as if nothing had changed. Cars moved through the November streets. The McDonald's drive-thru had a line. Children in puffy coats walked home from school. The ordinary world, indifferent as always to whatever private catastrophes were happening inside it. I stopped at a thrift store and bought the most forgettable clothes I could find. Dark jacket, dark jeans, a baseball cap with a wide brim. I had lost 15 pounds on the mountain, and I had a long scar running from my left temple to my jaw, where I had caught a rock face first during the fall. Between the weight loss and the scar and the cap pulled down over my forehead, I barely recognized myself in the mirror. Good. That was the point. At an electronics store near the center of town, I found what I was looking for, a digital voice recorder about the size of a USB drive. Black, matte finish, with 72 hours of continuous recording time on a single charge. I paid cash. That night, I sat in a cheap motel room on the edge of town, a place where you paid in cash and nobody looked at your face. And I held that little recorder in my hands for a long time. On it would depend everything. Whether I could bring Mark and Diane to justice. Whether I could get my daughter back. All of it, in this small black object that weighed almost nothing. The apartment complex where we lived was a 15-minute walk from the motel. I had spent 10 years in apartment 9B at the Ridgecrest complex on Orchard Street. I knew every sound that building made, every quirk of its old elevator, every face in its corridors. But now I stood across the street at the bus stop, just another woman waiting, head down, hands in her pockets, and watched the building from the outside. Watched, for one thing, the moment when Mark and Diane left together, because I knew by then that Diane had moved in. The logic was simple. She had helped him do this thing, and there was no going back to separate lives after that. The apartment where I had raised my daughter was now their apartment, and Emma was inside it. They came out at 3:45 that afternoon. Side by side, Diane's hand tucked into the crook of Mark's arm, her head tilted toward his shoulder, laughing about something. 12 days since he had pushed me off a mountain, and he was laughing in the November sunlight in the parking lot of the building where we had been a family. I waited until their car turned out of the complex and disappeared. I counted to 200 in case they had forgotten something and turned back. Then I crossed the street. The stairs were better than the elevator. I couldn't risk being recognized in that small enclosed space. 9 flights, with cracked ribs. I had to stop on the 4th floor and again on the 7th, pressing my forehead against the cold cinder block wall, breathing through the pain. But I kept moving. At our door, 9B, I raised my hand to the keypad. 10 years of the same code. My fingers moved automatically. Beep, beep, beep. Red light. He had changed it. Of course he had. She was gone, wasn't she? Dead and gone, and this was his home now. I stood there for a moment, with my hand in the air, and then I made myself think clearly. If he'd changed the code, he'd changed it to something he could remember. And the way certain minds work, especially minds that are caught up in their own private drama, their own private narrative, they often choose something meaningful to them. I came back the next day and waited, watched the keypad when he opened the door. 1, now do 3. October 23rd. The day he'd taken me up that mountain. He had made the day he killed me his front door code. Every time he came home, he pressed the date he thought he'd gotten away with it. I stood in the stairwell afterward and slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, and I pressed my hands over my mouth, and I let myself cry in complete silence for exactly as long as I needed to. Then I stood up. There was work to do. The next afternoon, I let myself into the apartment. The smell hit me first, her perfume, heavy and sweet, over the ghost of everything that had been ours, Emma's laundry detergent, the particular smell of our kitchen, 10 years of family compressed into the walls. The coffee table had empty beer bottles on it. The sink was full of dishes. Emma's bedroom door was closed. I stood very still and listened. From behind that closed door, a small sound. I crossed the room and turned the handle. Emma was in the corner, sitting with her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. She was holding the stuffed rabbit, faded tan velveteen, one eye re-sewn by my hand, when she was 4, that had slept with her every night of her life. The room was dark, the curtains drawn in the middle of the afternoon. The room smelled wrong. The smell of a space that hasn't been aired or properly cleaned. The smell of a child who has not been bathed. She heard me come in. Her head came up slowly, the way a person moves when they've been waiting so long for something that they've started to disbelieve it will come. She looked at me. For a long moment, she just looked, the way you look when you're not sure you're awake. Then her face broke entirely, and she reached for me. I went to her. I held her. I felt her small body shaking against mine, and I felt her fingers grip my jacket with everything she had, and I buried my face in her matted hair. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, which is what mothers say when they have not been able to protect their children, even when the failure was not their fault. And then I saw the bruise on her left cheek, yellowing at the edges, a week or more old, and the fresh one at her temple, dark purple, and the marks on her upper arm that were shaped exactly like the grip of adult fingers. I pressed my hand flat against the floor to keep from screaming. Emma watched me the way she always watches me, knowing, steady, reading my face the way she has always read my face. Because when you cannot speak, you become very good at reading faces. I pressed the recorder into the underside of the couch deep against the back frame, where no casual glance would find it. Then I got up, and I told Emma what I needed to tell her, and I left. The sound of her crying followed me all the way to the stairwell. I sat on the steps, and I did not make a single sound, and I breathed through it, and I got up, and I went back to the motel. I sat on that motel bed for 3 nights, waiting for the recorder to fill up. 3 of the longest nights of my life. On the 3rd day, I went back for the recorder. I won't tell you everything that was on it. Some of it I've made my peace with, and some of it I have no intention of carrying out of the private place where I've put it. But I'll tell you the parts that mattered. I sat on the edge of that motel bed and I hit play. And for a long time, it was just the white noise of people living in a house. The television, the clink of glasses, footsteps, the refrigerator door. I sped through it, listening for tones, for words that stood out. Diane's laugh, Mark's lower register, and then Diane's voice, suddenly sharper, suddenly different. You sure she's actually dead? My finger froze over the recorder. She fell 200 feet, Mark said, into a ravine. In the dark. They haven't found the body, but she's gone. The insurance people are going to want a death certificate. Diane's voice had the brisk, businesslike tone of someone working through a to-do list. How long does it take? Could be a few months. We waited out. I sat very still. The heater in the motel room clicked. Outside, a truck went by. The insurance money. He hadn't just wanted to be free of me. He had wanted to be paid for it. I kept listening. Most of what followed was the ordinary material of two people setting up a life together, who was doing laundry, what to have for dinner, a conversation about whether they needed a new couch, the ordinary texture of a life they were building on top of mine, on top of what they had done to me, in my apartment, in front of my daughter. I sped through it. And then Emma's voice, not words, because Emma doesn't have many words, but the sound I know as well as my own heartbeat, her cry. That particular quality of sound, tight and shaking, that means she is frightened and alone and in pain, followed immediately by Diane's voice, cold and flat as winter pavement. What are you doing out here? Get back in your room. A pause. I said, get back in your room. I don't want to look at you. The sound of a blow. Emma's cry going up sharply. Stop crying. Nobody wants to hear it. And then, most terrible of all, nothing from Mark. Nothing but the sound of the television volume going up. My daughter was crying, and he turned up the television. I put the recorder down on the bed, and I put my hands flat on my knees, and I breathed. In. Out, in, out, the way they teach you in Lamaze class, which I had taken alone because Mark had to work that weekend, which I should have recognized then as a sign of something. In, out. Then I picked it up again because I needed to hear it all. The last section of the recording was from 2 days before I retrieved it. I was almost at the end of the file when Diane's voice came through again. And the words she said stopped me cold. When are you getting rid of the kid? Silence from Mark. I mean it. I can't do this. She smells and she cries and she can't even talk. And I swear to God, Mark. I know. So when? A long pause. Then Mark said, tomorrow night. We'll take her out to the mountain. Leave her there. I was off the bed before the sentence was fully finished. I was pulling on my jacket and grabbing my keys and running for the door before my mind had fully processed what my body already knew. Tomorrow night. He had said tomorrow night. This was last night's recording. Tomorrow night was tonight. I ran, with cracked ribs that had barely finished knitting, with an arm that still ached, with knees that shook on the stairs. I ran out into the dark November street, and I ran toward the apartment complex, because there was no other direction. The motel was 8 blocks away. I ran all 8 of them. I burst into the lobby of the Ridgecrest complex and punched the elevator button and waited the 12 seconds it took with my hands against my thighs and my vision blurring at the edges from the pain of running. 9th floor, down the hall. Key code 1023, the day that was supposed to end me. The apartment was empty. The lights were off. The couch was bare. Diane's throw blanket was gone. Mark's running shoes. usually by the door, were gone. The apartment held only the smell of their life and the silence of a space recently vacated. I went to Emma's room. Her rabbit was on the floor, one ear caught under the bed frame, the stuffed body twisted out across the rug, as if it had been dropped in a hurry, as if small hands had been unable to keep hold of it when those hands were being pulled. Emma never slept without that rabbit. In 8 years, I could count on one hand the nights it wasn't in her arms. They had taken her so quickly that she couldn't hold on to it. I picked it up. I pressed it against my chest, and then I ran back out of the apartment, and I ran to the elevator, and I ran out of the building, and I stood on the sidewalk with the November wind in my face, and I thought the mountain. He took me to the mountain. He'll take her to the mountain. And then headlights! A cab, yellow, coming up the street with its light on. I stepped off the curb. The cab braked hard, tires barking against the asphalt. The bumper stopping close enough that I could feel the heat of the engine. The driver's window came down. "Lady, are you—" "Please," I said. I had the door open already. I was in the front seat. "Please, there's a black sedan, just ahead. I need you to follow it. My daughter is in that car and please." I had his arm. My face must have looked exactly like what it was, because the man mid-50s, gray at the temples, the face of someone who has seen enough of life to know desperation when it's sitting next to him, looked at me for 1 second. Then he put the car in gear. He was a good driver. He found them 3 blocks later, Mark's black sedan, moving through the lightly trafficked streets toward the highway. He kept 2 cars back the whole way, patient and unhurried, changing lanes when he needed to, never losing them, never getting close enough to spook. At the edge of town, where the streetlights thinned and the dark bulk of the mountains materialized against the sky, the sedan turned onto the forest road that led to the trailhead. The same trailhead. The same mountain. "Stop here," I said. "Turn off your lights." He did. I turned to give him money, and he waved his hand. "Go," he said. "Go on." I went. The mountain at night in November is a different world entirely from the mountain in October sunlight. The cold comes off the rock with a particular sharpness, like the mountain itself is breathing, and the dark under the trees is absolute. No moonlight that night. Stars, yes, but the canopy swallowed them. I followed the bobbing circle of Mark's phone flashlight up the trail, staying far enough back that the sound of my footsteps was lost in the crunch of frost on the leaves. Emma was between them. I could see her in the brief moments when the light caught her stumbling on the uneven ground, unable to move quickly with her cerebral palsy, Diane gripping her arm to keep her upright, or to keep her from getting away. One and the same thing to someone like Diane. Everything in me wanted to run forward, to call Emma's name, to tear her from their hands right then, but I forced myself to think. In the dark, on a steep trail, with 2 adults who had already proven they would not hesitate to use violence. If I announced myself too soon, anything could happen. They might run. Emma might fall. I needed them to stop. I needed them to be still. They stopped after about 10 minutes, in a flat place where the trail widened before a series of switchbacks. Mark said, "Here's fine." He said it the way you'd say it about a parking space. He let go of Emma's arm. She stumbled immediately, her legs not made for uneven ground, without support, and went down on her knees in the cold dirt. She made a sound, a low, breathless moan of pain and exhaustion and fear. Nobody reached down to help her. Diane looked down at her in the flashlight beam. No anger, no cruelty, even just the flat, disinterested look of someone disposing of an inconvenience. "Bye," she said. That was all. One word. Mark turned away. put his hand on Diane's shoulder. "Let's go." I stepped out of the trees. I said something I've been asked many times what I said. And the truth is, I don't know exactly. Something raw, something from the place below language, where rage and love and grief all live together. Whatever it was, it came out of my body like a sound the mountain might make, and it echoed off the rock faces above us, and both of them spun around like they'd been hit. Mark's face in the flashlight beam was white as chalk. His mouth opened. His hand went up as if to shield himself from something. Because I was something he had believed he'd disposed of. I was the inconvenient fact he'd thought he'd managed. I was the mountain itself, looking back at him. I did not look at him for long. I went to Emma first. I went down on my knees on the cold, rocky ground, and I took her face in my hands, and I said her name, and she grabbed me around the neck with both arms and held on with everything she had. Her whole small body was shaking from cold, from fear, from the sheer exhaustion of the last weeks. She was shaking and she was holding on and she was alive, and I held her back. Then Diane came at me. She got behind me and grabbed my hair and pulled, hard, and I went backward, and the pain from my ribs exploded up through my chest, and I hit the ground. She kicked me. Once, twice. I felt something in my side that told me the ribs that had just begun to heal were taking another toll. "Mark!" she screamed. Her voice had gone somewhere unhinged. "Mark, finish it! You know you have to." And Mark, my husband of 10 years, the man who had wept when Emma was born, who had told me on our wedding day that I was the only thing he'd ever been sure of. Mark looked around in the dark until he found what he was looking for. A rock, both hands around it, about the size of a cantaloupe. He lifted it. He walked toward me. And then, from behind him, "Put that down! Right now!" The voice was calm and absolute and completely unafraid. It was the voice of a man who has farmed through drought and flood and the betrayal of his own children and has not been broken by any of it. George Patterson stepped into the circle of flashlight. Behind him, her hand on his arm, was Eleanor. They had heard Emma crying. Sound carries in cold mountain air, and the Pattersons' cabin was not far. George had gone for his phone barely charged, barely functional, and called 911. "There's a child crying on the mountain at night," he'd told them. "Something is very wrong. Come now." And then he had not waited for the police. He had come himself, with his wife beside him, holding his arm, a 73-year-old man, with bad knees and a straight back, coming down the dark mountain toward the sound of a child who needed help. Because that is who George Patterson was. Mark turned toward them with the rock still in his hands, and the look on his face was the look of a cornered animal. He took a step toward George, and then I was behind him. I don't have a lot of upper body strength. I was injured and exhausted, and I hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days. But I put everything I had into the shove I gave him from behind, both hands flat against his back, and the weight of the rock threw off his center of gravity, and he went face down onto the trail. The rock rolled out of his hands. The lights came 30 seconds later, 6 beams from different angles, flooding the narrow clearing with a sudden, flat, revelatory brightness. Officers in dark jackets and tactical vests, weapons holstered, moving in fast. The lead officer spoke, "Drop the rock. Don't move. You are under arrest for attempted murder." Mark was on his knees in the dirt, blood on his chin where he'd hit the trail. His hands were shaking. He was trying to say something. She came at us, I didn't." But his voice was coming apart at the seams. Diane ran. 2 steps. Then 2 officers had her arms, and the cuffs were on, and she was screaming, "I didn't do anything." He made me. It wasn't me. And the screaming was still going when they walked her down the mountain. I sat on the ground with Emma in my arms. A young officer put a thermal blanket around us. I pulled it around Emma's shoulders and held her against my chest, and looked across the clearing to where George and Eleanor stood, slightly apart from the officers, George's hand at Eleanor's back. Eleanor was crying not with distress, but with the particular relief of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time. George caught my eye. He gave me one small nod. I mouthed thank you. He shook his head, said something I couldn't hear over the distance and the activity around us. Later, when I asked him what he'd said, he told me, "That's what people are supposed to do." The trial was 2 months later. I won't spend much time there. The recording I had made did most of the talking for me. Mark's attorney tried to characterize it as entrapment. The judge was not persuaded. The recording was played in open court Diane's voice, asking whether I was dead. Both their voices planning to abandon my daughter on a mountain in November. The sounds of Emma being struck. The television volume going up. Mark was convicted of attempted murder, conspiracy, child endangerment, and child abuse. 15 years. Diane received 10 years for conspiracy to commit murder and child abuse. The judge ordered that Mark's assets, the joint accounts, the life insurance policy he had taken out on me, the retirement fund be transferred to me and Emma. I sat in the courtroom and felt nothing dramatic when the sentences were read. No triumph, no vindication, just the quiet settling of something that had been unresolved. Just over. I need to tell you what happened next, because this is the part that matters most. Winter passed. Emma slept in her own room with her rabbit, and I slept in mine, and the apartment was clean and quiet, and entirely ours. But in the evenings, after Emma was in bed, I would sit at the kitchen table and feel the particular silence of a space that used to hold more people. Not Mark. I won't insult either of us by pretending I missed him. But the idea of a family, the shape of it, the 4 chairs around a table where only 2 were filled. Emma needed more than I could give alone. She had always needed more. 8 years of solo caregiving had taught me that. And I had no parents. My mother had died when I was in college, my father a few years after. No siblings nearby. No close friends. I thought of George and Eleanor, alone on their mountain. Children who had stopped calling. A hunting cabin with a leaky roof and hauled water, and the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, just empty. In the first week of April, when the dogwoods were blooming in the valley, and the redbuds were just opening on the hillsides, Emma and I drove up the mountain road. We parked at the trailhead and walked the path. Emma was slow on the uneven ground, but she was steady with my hand in hers, and we took our time. The mountain in April is a completely different creature from the mountain in October or November. All green and pink and pale yellow, smelling of new growth and wet earth, birds calling from every direction. We found the cabin in the afternoon light. George was in the garden patch beside it, crouched over the turned earth with a trowel, planting the first seeds of the season. He didn't hear us on the path. Eleanor came out of the cabin door and saw us first. She said, "Oh my goodness." George stood up. He looked at me and then at Emma, and his face went through something that I don't have the right words for. Joy, yes, but more than that. The particular joy of someone who gave up expecting good things a long time ago and has been surprised anyway. "Is this her?" he asked. "This is Emma," I said. Eleanor came and knelt down in the dirt in front of my daughter, putting herself at Emma's eye level. Emma looked at her steadily. Emma's face has its own language, and then, slowly, she nodded. Eleanor reached up and took Emma's hand, and Emma let her. We had tea inside. Eleanor made it from dried herbs, the same tea she'd given me in those first days after the accident. Bitter and warming and somehow restorative. We sat around the table, and I told them about the trial and the verdict and the months since. And George nodded, and Eleanor said, "Thank goodness," at intervals. And Emma sat between us with her rabbit in her lap, watching everyone's faces. And then Emma spoke. She doesn't speak often, and when she does, it costs her the effort of coordinating breath and tongue and lips against the resistance of her condition. But she turned to Eleanor, and she drew in a careful breath, and she said, "Thank you." 2 words, 3 syllables, each one deliberate and clear. Eleanor pressed her hand over her mouth. George turned away and looked out the window at the bare garden and lifted his hand to his eye, and I pretended not to see. Emma knew. She had been in that mountain clearing, in the dark and the cold, and she had heard a voice come out of the darkness telling them to stop. She couldn't say it in words, but she had carried it in her chest for months, and now she was giving it back. I asked them that afternoon if they would come and live with us. I didn't dress it up. I said I have a 3-bedroom apartment and 2 empty chairs at my table. I said Emma needs people, and so do I, and so do you, and there is no reason in the world we can't choose each other. George said, "We're old people, Susan. We're not easy." I said, "Neither am I." Eleanor was crying again, but she was smiling through it, and she held my hand and nodded before she had words. George took longer. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at me. Then he said slowly, "I suppose the mountain will get along without us." We moved them down in May. George brought his garden tools and 3 flats of seedlings and immediately commandeered the apartment balcony, which now has more plants on it than some people have in their backyards. Eleanor took the kitchen as her domain and has been feeding us magnificently ever since. Emma follows Eleanor from room to room the way she once followed me, her highest compliment. George tells Emma stories every evening before bed. Old stories, new stories, stories he makes up as he goes. Emma sits with her rabbit and watches his face and laughs the soundless laugh that opens her whole face up. It is the laugh I prayed for every night for 8 years. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry, if I carry what Mark and Diane did like a stone in my chest. And the honest answer is sometimes. Some nights it comes back the feeling of hands on my back, the tilting of the earth, the free fall. Some mornings I wake up, and the anger is right there, fresh and hot. But then Emma comes in, walking slowly down the hall with her rabbit under one arm, and Eleanor is already in the kitchen, making oatmeal, and George is on the balcony talking to his tomatoes, and the anger loses its grip. Because the thing they tried to take from me, Emma, safety, a family, I have all of it. More of it than before. And they have nothing. They thought they were throwing us away. Mark, Diane, even George and Eleanor's children, who put 2 good people out on a mountain to make room for their own convenience. They all made the same calculation: these people are worth less than what they cost. And every single one of them was wrong. The family you're born into is one thing. The family you choose is another. And the family that finds you in the dark and carries you up a mountain, that is something else entirely. Something that doesn't have a word yet. Something that is, in my experience, the most permanent kind. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and my family. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below. Every message means the world to us. And if you know someone who needs to hear that it is possible to survive the unsurvivable and come out the other side with more love than you started with, share this story with them.